Hey everyone, welcome to the New Populist. Thanks for joining me. I want to talk today about Alexander Dugin. Now, in the West, we hear this name and most of us don't know who he is. But for those of us who do know who he is, he's often treated as a bad guy. He is called Putin's brain. He's this crazy Russian nationalist that is hell bent on restoring the Soviet Union and being this evil guy that we should all should hate. And of course, that is not necessarily the truth. We have a certain viewpoint from the West that is colored by our own biases. We look at anybody who takes a stance against the United States or against our value system as being inherently evil. And you can't blame people for that. As an American myself, I too am biased toward the United States. But when I look at international conflict and I want to find solutions going forward that prevent all these wars and all this destruction, you have to try to understand the other side. If you are unwilling to understand why they don't like you or have a problem with you, you're going to keep just bumping heads with them and conflict will never stop. So this guy Alexander Dugin, he is described as Putin's brain, and that's really an exaggeration. There is no real evidence that he has any relationship with Vladimir Putin. They may have overlapping ideas, but it was really some article that really gave this idea that he was connected to Putin. And like a lot of things in the media and newspapers, just because they say so doesn't mean it's so. But who is Alexander Dugin? What is he as far as an equivalent to somebody in the U.S.? Well, he's a philosopher. He's an academic. He has ideas about what Russia needs to do to regain some of its glory. And I would compare Alexander Dugin to any member of a U.S. think tank. Now, one think tank that I've talked about in the past, PNAC, Project for a New North American Century, members of that think tank really were the architects of the Iraq War and a lot of the destabilizing things going on right now in the Middle East. They are responsible for that. They talked about a new Pearl Harbor that could galvanize the American public to support new wars in the Middle East. And do we look at these people as being evil? Well, at the time, we did. Dick Cheney, for example, Robert Kagan, Bill Kristol, these folks that were in the Bush administration, they were often looked upon as being evil for starting these wars. Now, of course, 20 years later, in the era of Trump, these people have been rehabilitated and they're no longer looked at as these evil people that they once were. But that is who Alexander Dugin is, and as far as a comparison to the United States, he's just a guy who has his ideas. He's an academic, and to cast him as being this evil creature is just it's not fair and it's not accurate. And so the question is, what exactly does he believe that triggers people in the West? And that's the key thing there. It's the hatred for him is about the ideas as far as how they threaten our view of the world. And so he wrote a book called The Fourth Political Ideology. And I have a few excerpts from there, just a couple, that kind of gives you an idea of the thought process. It's a very involved book. And let's not go down that rabbit hole of trying to examine the whole thing. I just want to give you a gist of what he believes and how he views the world from a Russian viewpoint. So I'm going to read these two excerpts, and I think this will give you an idea of how he views the West and how he views Russia and the different political systems that we've experienced the last 100 years. So check this out. He says, For my own country, Russia, the fourth political theory, among other things, has an immense practical significance. The majority of Russian people suffer their integration into global society as a loss of their own identity. The Russian population had almost entirely rejected the liberal ideology in the 1990s, but it is also apparent that a return to the illiberal political ideologies of the 20th century, such as communism or fascism, is unlikely, as these ideologies have already failed and proven themselves unequal to the challenge of opposing liberalism, to say nothing of the moral cost of totalitarianism. And I think this is an interesting excerpt because this is the key thing here. They as Russians, look at the Western system, the liberal world order, as we've heard a member of the Biden administration say. They look at that as something that will destroy their national identity. And if you look at the European Union and the centralization of power by those EU autocrats, you can kind of see their point. There has been a loss of national identity in the West, in the United States, and Canada, and Germany, and France. This massive migration. We have seen the borders sort of melt away, and decision making is not made by the people in those countries anymore. They're made by these elite liberal bureaucrats. So from that aspect, you can sort of understand why the Russians may not want to cooperate with the West in our system. And I made a video, and I'll link to it, where I talk about in the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse, there was a period of privatization under Yeltsin where 7 oligarchs grabbed control of 50 to 70% of the entire Russian economy. And when Putin came into office, he chased those guys out the country and they all fled to London. These were guys that were backed up by financial interest in the West. We were hoping under Yeltsin during the 90s that Russia would be absorbed into the Western system. But when Putin came into office, he stopped that from happening, reversed course, and here we are now 20 years later fighting this proxy war in Ukraine, NATO versus Russia. And that is exactly what it is. It's a proxy war. This is a geopolitical fight that's gone on for decades between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the West. Anybody saying this is about freedom for the Ukrainian people, they're propagandists or they're completely ignorant. It is much more than that. But let me go on and read the next excerpt. And here he says, therefore, in order to fill this political and ideological vacuum, Russia needs a new political idea. For Russia, liberalism does not fit, but communism and fascism are equally unacceptable. Consequently, we need a fourth political theory. And if for some readers this is a question of freedom of choice and the realization of a political will, which can always be viewed from a positive or negative position, then for Russia, it is a matter of life or death, to be or not to be, in terms of Hamlet's eternal question. If Russia chooses to be, then it will automatically bring about the creation of a fourth political theory. Otherwise, for Russia, there remains only the choice not to be, which will mean to quietly leave the historical and world stage, dissolving into a global order which is not created or governed by us. So, for Alexander Dugin and people who think like him, they see this as a binary choice. Either create a new fourth ideology, a new politic, or be absorbed by the Western system, by liberalism, which was not created by them and is not controlled by them. And if that were to happen, they will essentially become a shadow of themselves, be absorbed into the West, and cease to exist as a sovereign nation state. So you look at the war in Ukraine, you look at the Russians' actions. For them, this is a liberalism, and NATO in the West is an existential threat. That is why they are doing what they're doing right now in Ukraine. Right or wrong, again, all my analysis is not necessarily making a judgment if it's right or wrong. I'm trying to understand why things are happening, why Russia is behaving the way Russia is behaving, and why the West is behaving the way the West is behaving. Now, further, what does Dugin envision? And here's where we really need to pay attention, because we're starting to see some elements of this happening. They want to have a Eurasian continent, Russia, Iran, China, India, sovereign countries that are going to create some sort of shield against liberalism and fight back as a group against the liberal world order. Now, in the foreword of this book, the guy who writes this foreword, Alan Searle, spells it out. He says, in fourth political theory, Dugin shows that the only way to build a multipolar world founded on authentic values is to resolutely turn one's back on the Atlanticist West and its false values. And how can this be achieved? Only by unconditionally preserving the geopolitical sovereignty of the powers of the Eurasian continent, Russia, China, Iran, India, which safeguard the freedom of all other peoples on the planet. Now, let's stop with this idea that China or Iran are going to safeguard the freedom of the people on the planet. That's, again, this is the Russian point of view, and I can laugh at that, knowing that China is the most authoritarian country in the world, or at least among the top authoritarian countries in the world. So, again, this is the Russian point of view, and I can look at that and go, okay, come on, it's a damn joke. But what's more important is what he's pointing at, which is an alliance between Russia, China, Iran, and India. Now, we know that Russia and India have had an alliance going back for years now with military stuff, and they have a lot of support there. But now we're seeing, in these last 6 months, Russia, China, and India cooperating. And right now, Putin is observing the war games where China and India are in Russia participating. And this is a big deal, because people may not know this, but there is a huge rift, or not a lot of warmth between China and India. Matter of fact, when I used to live in India and watch Bollywood films, the Bollywood films would often portray the Chinese in a very unflattering light. There's not a lot of love lost between the two groups here. So now, if India and China are starting to cooperate in war games and these exercises and willing to work together, that should be a really big deal for the West. We've always looked at India as being an ally of the West, there's a lot of Indians living in England and the United States. We've always had a good relationship with them. But we're seeing a move toward neutrality by India. They are still buying Russian oil. They are not going along with the dictates of the U.S. government. We spoke up and said, hey, please don't participate in these war games with Russia. And India said, yeah, we're going to anyway. They did not listen. So they're playing a game here where they're staying neutral, and they're actually cooperating more with China and with Russia. And of course, we can also add in the fact that they're setting up this financial system that excludes the dollar and has is a financial block of, just again, China, Russia, India, and other countries in the Eurasian continent. So they're setting up this opposition to the United States and the West, and creating this multipolar world. It's happening right now in front of you, And unfortunately, I don't think enough people realize how quickly things are changing. We're seeing this energy issue in Europe that is spiraling out of control and will only get worse. We're seeing countries move away from the U.S. dollar. That happened recently. I think today, matter of fact, that was mentioned in the news. We're seeing this new financial and military bloc in Eurasia. The world is changing fast. And we in the United States are very arrogant. We can't envision a world where we're not number one. And we think, and this is proven by our action with sanctions, that we can just sanction Russia. And they were supposed to just collapse and go away. It didn't happen. The world is changing. And as the world changes, this is where things can be very, very dangerous. When one power finally realizes, oh crap, we may be on the way out, and the other one's rising, that's how you get all the fireworks and things can spiral out of control. And that, of course, is the fear with Ukraine, that if one side starts to lose, and that side is probably going to be the United States, there's an escalation. And, of course, the final escalation is when nukes are fired off. And then, of course, we all lose. So this is the theory of Alexander Dugin. This is what he thinks, what he believes. He wants a strong, sovereign Russia that is not influenced by the West. He wants to create a power bloc in Eurasia. And clearly, his viewpoint is very popular in Russia, probably with Putin. And that is ultimately what we're against. We do not want to see this bloc rise. But ironically, we're doing everything we can to actually make it happen with these sanctions. And it might be one of the worst miscalculations we've ever made. And over the next year, we're going to find out just how bad a miscalculation that was. Things will be very, very interesting. Well, that's it for now. Again, if you are new to the channel, please like and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.